Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Pocket History of Human Evolution, How We Became Sapiens, by Sylvana Condemi and Francois Savatier, narrated by Christa Lewis. Introduction. Homo sapiens is a strange animal. Our ancestors first lived in trees, then came down to explore the ground. Then they became bipeds and eventually explored the world. From there, the possibilities were endless. This changing behavior is one of the greatest enigmas there is, but we are in the process of unraveling it with the help of amazing recent advancements in prehistoric sciences. Through the extraction and sequencing of fossilized DNA, we've learned that 40,000 years ago, we were still sharing Earth with at least 3 other human species. And we know that sapiens, an African species, crossbred with 2 other species outside of Africa. From new fossils, we've also been able to prove that our ancestors did not originate exclusively in East Africa, but were actually a Pan-African species. We've also discovered that Sapiens actually left its Pan-African cradle for the first time 100,000 years earlier than we had previously thought. Though we have discovered so much about Homo sapiens over the years, there are still many unanswered questions about what caused us to become uniquely human. Was it climate change that propelled our supposed arboreal ancestors from the forests onto the ground in the savannas, setting in motion a series of complex anatomical changes? Was it bipedalism, which freed up our hands for other tasks, the use of tools, our large brains? Did we become human because we were capable of empathy and cooperation? For a long time, there were contradicting theories. Then, in 2015, we discovered something astonishing. 3.3 million years ago, in what would become present-day Kenya, stone tools were being made by hand. The oldest human fossil is estimated to be from 2.8 million years ago. So the hands that made these tools could not have been human. They could very well have belonged to Australopithecus, a pre-human. So it wasn't tools that made us human after all. This news has led us to take a closer look at our ancestors, to discover new developments about sapiens. In this book, we will focus on the progressive stages of hominization, the evolutionary transformation of pre-human forms into Homo, including the cultural aspect of becoming human, which began in Africa more than 3 million years ago with Australopithecus. This was an astonishing transformation, one that gave rise to a strange and singular erect creature with strong cognitive abilities, whose most evolved form, sapiens, carries the heritage of all its ancestors. We all know that the primary role of sapiens' advanced cognition is to help us survive. But where? In nature or in society? Sapiens is weak when alone in nature, but in groups we become the greatest predator that has ever existed. This seems ecologically impossible, a ubiquitous species that has transformed nature into its home, a home that has now reached global dimensions. In this book, we will explain this enigmatic evolutionary saga. This is the history of a cultural animal, you. Chapter 1. A biped descends from an ape. It was the increasing use of natural resources that pushed ancient primates toward the first human form. This not only led our ancestors toward bipedalism, walking upright on the ground, a more efficient way of moving, but it also triggered a self-reinforcing cycle. The more bipedal they were, the more success they had in collecting resources on the ground, which reinforced bipedalism, and so on. This alone, however, does not explain why humans became permanent bipeds. In 1748, humans officially became animals for the first time. In his book Systema Naturae, A System of Nature, the botanist and zoologist Carl Linnaeus, 1707 to 1778, placed us in a group of related animal species, a genus that he called Homo, and classified us as sapiens, meaning wise. Today, Homo sapiens is the only existing human form. As mammals, warm-blooded animals that nurse their young, sapiens are members of the order of primates, apes with 5 fingers, front-facing eyes, and an upright torso when sitting. We don't know when primates first appeared, but we do know that they already existed during the Eocene era, which occurred from 56 to 33.9 million years ago. Where did they come from? We don't know this either. But 70 million years ago, when dinosaurs dominated Earth, there also existed a proto-primate called Purgatorius, a small animal the size of a mouse. So once the dinosaurs disappeared, modern mammals, including primates, were able to multiply their numbers. Today, the majority of primates live in the tropics and are adapted to arboreal life, which suggests that humans' most ancient ancestors, hominid apes, lived in tropical forests where trees were tall and fruit was abundant. Most of today's hominid apes live in Africa, which points to an African origin for the human species. Pre-human hominins. There is overwhelming evidence, from the number of fossils of prehistoric hominins found in Africa, that suggests an African origin for Homo. Today, the hominid family includes humans, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. In addition, we have discovered many fossils, mostly of Ardipithecus, Paranthropus, and Australopithecus, which are our pre-human ancestors, namely hominins that are more closely related to us than they are to chimpanzees. So we can define the hominid family as all of the great apes that have a human-like form and the same ability to walk on 2 legs. There's evidence in the form of rare fossilized skeletal fragments that the hominin family already existed around 7 million years ago. What do all these fragments reveal? Actually, something quite fascinating, that the hominin evolutionary tree actually looks more like a bush, which shows that hominins passed through a series of significant evolutionary stages, periods during which several related species, possessing nearly the same body type and lifestyles, coexisted. The first of these evolutionary stages is the transition from an arboreal quadruped posture to an imperfect bipedalism, meaning that these hominins were capable of walking on 2 legs but continued to be arboreal. Some specimens you might be familiar with are Tumai, a Sahelanthropus chidensis specimen from 7 million years ago, Aurorantuganensis from 6 to 5.7 million years ago, and Ardipithecus from almost 5 million years ago. Of the oldest contender for earliest biped, Tumai, we have only a fragment of femur bone and a skull, deformed by the sedimentary deposits not far from ancient Lake Chad. According to its discoverer, Michel Brunet, a paleontologist from the Collège de France, the fairly central position, under the skull rather than on the back of its occipital foramen, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord connects to the brain, strongly suggests that Tumai had already adapted to erect posture and bipedalism on the ground. For this reason, Brunet sees Tumai as one of the members of the hominin lineage, Still closely related to the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees, but there is still some debate about whether this is adequate proof of bipedalism. It is hard to determine, since for the moment no other specimens of this species have been found. Another ancient member of the human lineage is Aurorantuganensis. Discovered by the paleontologists Brigitte Senut and Martin Pickford of the French National Museum of Natural History, Auroran is known from a dozen fossil fragments, belonging to 4 individuals found in 3 locations in Kenya. With this hominin, it's the shape of the femur, which more closely resembles that of Homo sapiens than earlier hominid species and suggests an erect posture, while the ape-like curved thumb, adapted to climbing trees, also indicates an arboreal lifestyle. The Ardipithecus specimens unearthed in Ethiopia, Ardipithecus kadaba, 5.8 million to 5.2 million years ago, and its likely successor, Ardipithecus ramidus, 4.4 million years ago, are much better preserved and much more informative. It seems that the hominins that reached this stage of evolution were capable of only imperfect bipedalism. Their feet were well adapted to walking but still had an opposable thumb, like the foot of a chimpanzee. While this walking thumb severely limited Ardipithecus's effectiveness while walking on the ground, it allowed them to climb trees quickly, as their hands still had the long fingers of a climbing monkey. One species of Ardipithecus, possibly Ardipithecus ramidus, then evolved into Australopithecus, most likely Australopithecus anamensis, around 4.5 million years ago. In the footsteps of Australopithecus. Fittingly, the second significant stage of hominin evolution is the first true biped, Australopithecus. While its genus name, Australopithecus, meaning ape of the south, is a reference to its first discovery in South Africa in 1924, Australopithecus specimens have also been found in the Great Rift Valley in East Africa. As crazy as it might seem, the oldest evidence we have of Australopithecus is not a fossil at all, but a few footprints that have been preserved. They belong to 3 specimens of Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as the famous Lucy. Around 3.8 million years ago, at a site called Laetoli in what is now Tanzania, the Sataman volcano covered the earth in a 6-inch thick bed of ash, which preserved the footprints of 3 Australopithecus specimens who walked through it together. These footprints are especially fascinating because they resemble those of modern-day humans. The first toe on the foot, the hallux, is not opposable as it is in great monkeys, but instead lines up along the 4 other toes, like that of sapiens. Therefore, while the 2 plantar arches, longitudinal and transverse, are not as pronounced, the Australopithecus foot is very similar to ours. We can also see from these footprints that the point of impact on the ground was made toward the heel, which implies that Australopithecus had not yet adopted the characteristic walk of the human, toes first, followed by the tightening of the plantar arch, and then the heel on the ground. Their hands also resemble ours, except that the first phalange of the thumb doesn't allow for as much movement as that of a human hand, and the fingers are long and slightly curved. This hand, along with long arms, narrow shoulders, and an upwardly narrowing thorax, shows an agility suited to climbing trees. These characteristics are found in other species of Australopithecus, most notably in those originating in South Africa, Australopithecus africanus, 3 to 2.6 million years ago, and Australopithecus sediba, 2 million years ago, but with the latter, fairly long lower limbs indicate a substantial body size, which will become a crucial characteristic of fossils connected to the Homo genus. Even though Australopithecus had hands and feet comparable to ours, it doesn't seem that they were exclusively bipedal. Some paleontologists have compared them to bonobos, meaning that they would have had a highly developed social life and spent most of their time on the ground foraging, but remained largely dependent on forest trees. In particular, they would have found safety in the heights, which makes us wonder, did they build nests in the trees to sleep in like chimpanzees? It is with this chimpanzee behavior in mind that, after re-examining Lucy's bones, John Kappelman and his colleagues from the University of Texas at Austin suggested in a 2016 Nature article that she died by falling from a tree. What triggered the evolution toward bipedalism among certain hominid populations? Yves Coppens of the Collège de France, who discovered, along with the American anthropologist Donald Johanson, the famous Australopithecus Lucy, suggested that the cause is climate change, brought on by the formation of the Great Rift Valley. According to a theory that he calls East Side Story, the consequence of this geological event was a partial replacement of the forest by the savanna in East Africa. As a result, the quadrupedal primates accustomed to life in the trees had to move into open spaces, which was easier on two legs, setting in motion their evolution toward bipedalism. But Coppens's theory, also called the savanna hypothesis, is not in agreement with the most recent environmental data, which shows that Auroran, Ardipithecus, and even Lucy occupied a mosaic territory with dense woodland, bushland, and savanna close to bodies of water. Some researchers have suggested that our upright posture began in our past arboreal life and was an advantage for standing on trees while feeding. Therefore, we don't yet have a definitive answer to this question. Homo, the obligate biped. The third significant evolutionary stage, one that we still haven't left behind, is that of the obligate biped, fully committed and adapted for walking only on the ground with two legs. Much more complex than it seems, biomechanically speaking, this method of movement is absolutely unique to terrestrial vertebrates. In fact, it is the defining characteristic of the Homo genus and distinguishes us from all other hominids. But how did it come about? We think that it was through a gradual refinement of Australopithecus's imperfect bipedalism. This opinion is backed up by an intense study of Australopithecus afarensis foot bones carried out by Carol Ward of the University of Missouri. She suggests that Lucy's relatives had arched feet, meaning they'd already adopted a way of moving that is similar to ours and, through this, became semi-human. The shift from facultative to obligate bipedalism is evident in most ancient human species, notably in Homo habilis, 2.8 to 1.44 million years ago, who lived in Southeast Africa. While its cranial capacity was modest, closer to that of Australopithecus, a third of ours, its feet were very similar to a present-day human's. According to the nearly complete fossils that are available to us, the Homo habilis foot was rigid, possessing a vaulted plantar and bones similar in proportion to ours. This indicates obligate bipedalism, according to Yvette Deloison, a specialist in hominid locomotion from the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS. Almost as old as Homo habilis and confined to East Africa, Homo rudolfensis, 2.45 to 1.45 million years ago, was more robust and had a cranial capacity that was slightly more developed. It was also clearly an obligate biped. Thus, it's clear that obligate bipedalism is what distinguishes the Homo genus from Australopithecus. That's why the dominant hypothesis among paleontologists is that the evolution toward increased bipedalism marked the start of the transition from Australopithecus toward a human form. Homo, master of the earth. Nevertheless, one question remains. What triggered this evolution? Because something pushed one lineage of Australopithecus to use natural resources on the ground to a greater extent and to expend less energy doing so. And lots of research supports this viewpoint. In 2010, a team led by David Raiklin of the University of Arizona concluded that in covering the same distance, a human expends only a quarter of the energy that a chimpanzee does on 4 legs. These same researchers also found that chimpanzees expend the same amount of energy whether they walk on 4 legs or 2. Thus, regardless of whether they take small steps while standing upright or use all of their muscles to run on 4 feet, they always expend more energy than humans. As soon as ancient hominins started to make use of ground natural resources, evolution could only move toward decreased energy expenditure, meaning increased bipedalism. The need to traverse larger areas created a selective pressure toward increased bipedalism. In Kibale National Park in Uganda, a team led by Sabrina Krief of the French National Museum of Natural History has observed that the typical habitat of a chimpanzee covers about 8 square miles, 20 square kilometers, but most of the time they use only a quarter of it. By comparison, ethnographic research has estimated that, depending on the climate, in warm areas resources are abundant, but in colder climates resources can be scarce. A group of hunter-gatherers would have needed to utilize up to 500 square miles, 1,300 square kilometers. Bipedalism would also have been more advantageous for surveying an environment populated by a number of predators that would have been dangerous to fragile pre-humans. Lucy was only 3 feet tall. A powerful evolutionary accelerator. The move toward a greater use of natural resources, however, does not entirely explain our evolution toward obligate bipedalism. Let's remember that during the second significant stage of evolution, several related species of Australopithecus lived simultaneously, and though they were already mostly bipedal, not all of them developed obligate bipedalism. The most convincing explanation for this curious phenomenon is that one lineage of Australopithecus accelerated their evolution, advancing more quickly than the others toward obligate bipedalism and, therefore, toward greater success at collecting natural resources on the ground. Over time, a span of about 1 million years, this lineage would have become so dominant that they would have first triggered the extinction of every related species in the same ecological niche, and eventually those outside it. Chapter 2. Culture, the Evolutionary Accelerator. Culture caused the emergence of the human lineage by accelerating the evolution of certain Australopithecus toolmakers. Their enhanced stature and increased cerebral volume triggered the process of hominization, which gave rise to larger and more cooperative human social groups maintained by linguistic grooming. What transformed certain lineages of Australopithecus into humans? We believe it's quite clear. Culture. Culture refers to any set of behavioral traits, symbols, and ideas shared by an animal group across space, within members of the same group and time, over generations. According to this definition, groups of dolphins or chimpanzees also have cultures, though it hasn't had the same evolutionary impact for these animals that it has had for humans. Could culture have developed differently for certain lineages of Australopithecus as bipedalism freed up the use of their hands? Yes, as we learned in 2015, when it was discovered that stone tools were being made before the known emergence of Homo. In a site called Lomekwi 3, not far from the western shore of Kenya's Lake Turkana, a team led by the prehistorian Sonia Harmond of CNRS and Stony Brook University discovered the oldest known stone tools, fashioned 3.3 million years ago, and therefore evidence for change in the hominin lifestyle. The oldest discovered fossil of the Homo genus is the partial jaw LD 350-1, still carrying 6 teeth, found in Lady Gararu, Ethiopia, which dates back to 2.8 million years ago. The tools from Lomekwi 3, which indicate a stone culture now known as Lomekwian, are thus 500,000 years older than the oldest fossil evidence of the Homo genus. The simplest explanation for this confounding development is that these tools were carved by the only hominids around at that time, some form of Australopithecus. Cultivated, but flat-faced. Sonia Harmon's team drew attention to the nearby discovery of Kenyanthropus platyops, the flat-faced man from Kenya, a fossilized specimen that doesn't display the long face typical of apes, but rather a much shorter face, in which some paleontologists see the characteristics of both Australopithecus afarensis and early Homo. Kenyanthropus platyops seems to be in the same evolutionary stage as Australopithecus, specifically Australopithecus afarensis, which lived in the same area at the same time. Since there couldn't have been aliens in Kenya 3.3 million years ago, the most logical conclusion is that either Australopithecus afarensis or Kenyanthropus platyops made the tools found at Lomekwi 3. But no matter which group made them, we can definitively say that the first tool makers date back to the evolutionary stage of Australopithecus. Toolmaking is a cultural phenomenon from a culture that preceded Homo. Can we actually believe this? Yes, and here's why. Since the primatologist and anthropologist Jane Goodall studied the chimpanzees of Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania in the 1960s, we've known that non-human hominids use tools, but they use tools of circumstance, such as clubs or rocks, for tasks like digging holes or cracking nuts open. The stone tools at Lomekwi 3, by contrast, were intentionally knapped stone tools to produce sharp edges. They were made using two techniques: direct impact on a stationary anvil, hitting the stone on a block to carve it, and bipolar impact on an anvil, shaping the stone with another while holding it against a block. This complexity implies that these techniques were mastered by the group and thus transmitted within the framework of a cultural tradition. Moreover, these two methods of carving illustrate that, like the evolution of the species, technical evolution is also bushy. The techniques diversify constantly, creating branches that die quickly, but the main trunk continues to grow. As the prehistorian Hélène Roche of the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, who played a preeminent role in this research, explains, Pleistocene behavioral evolution is a complex thing, as complex as biological evolution. The Pleistocene, we should note, is the era of Lomekwi 3. Now, a stunning picture emerges. It's very likely that from the end of the Pliocene epoch, 5.3 to 2.58 million years ago, to the beginning of the Pleistocene.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?